Hey everybody, Ragnarok here. Today we're going to be going over some basic endgame principles, primarily with a pawn and a king versus a king. And this is important because a lot of endgames that you may encounter are going to simple down to this form here. It's important to understand some basic ideas. The first one we're going to be looking at in this video is going to be opposition, whether it's regular opposition, distant opposition, or diagonal. We're going to take a look at all three. So opposition is going to occur when you have both kings separated by just one square in between them. And whoever's move it is essentially the losing side. So white here, if it's white to move, has the opposition, and black has to move out of the way. If it's black to move, he would have to move here. Either here or to the other side. It doesn't matter. Whichever side he moves to, the white king is now going to move into the opposite direction to try to support this pawn to move forward and essentially queen. That's the main goal that you want to have. If the king does move back down here, you do have opposition again, but the king doesn't have to move because I can now check, move my pawn with check. And if the king moves back, again I'm going to maintain that opposition, one square away from each other. The king also can't start to come towards the pawn, so he has to continue to move this way. And now the king has to move out of the way because the opposition here occurs and the king had no other move. And now this is really the end goal of what you want to get to. You want to get your king onto, essentially I like to call this the dream square, because it supports all three pawn pushes. And when there's no other pieces on the board, this king can't be moved. And he can just start pushing his pawn up. So just to play out the scenario, check, check again, and then you promote into a queen. So just to give you guys some other examples of how you can get to this scenario, let's start with just the kings a little bit further away, keeping the same idea of how we wanted to end up like we did in the previous example. If it's black to move, he's yielding the opposition and trying to chase over to this pawn. And if it's white to move, same idea, trying to get over to the pawn here. So let's go with white to move first. King is moving into opposition here, and this won't really matter too much until you're all the way over here. And now it's exactly the same idea as we had before. If it's black to move, black is going to yield the opposition and the pawn can start moving forward. And since right now it's white to move, white has one extra move like we did before, which is why he wanted to move here and not one square backwards. Now the king has to move. He moves here. Essentially, you want to stay in front. The previous example, we had the king move into opposition again, and as we've seen, opposition is not going to be good. You want to avoid that. So he's going to want to stay in front of the pawn. That's one of the essential endgame principles. Just stay in front of the pawn if you have just a king, and your rook as well would want to stay in front of the pawn. We now move again into opposition. The king has to move out of the way. It doesn't matter which way. We're going to do the same thing and just go to the other side. The king now still wants to stay in front of the pawn. Start to move our pawn. He would come here. Move our pawn. He would come here. And now we move into opposition again. Opposition again. We got our one square between the kings. The king has to yield. Doesn't matter which way. And now we've got that dream square. And let's just play it again. Check. And we queen. So that's why opposition is really, really important to have. So to set up an idea with a common endgame, rook and rook versus rook, pawn, king, let's just say in this scenario we've decided to check the king and the king doesn't want to move away. Let's say he blocks with a rook. Well, then I would just take his rook because I know that I can gain the opposition here, and now the proper move is going to be actually to move here. We don't want to move here. We don't want to move here because this is how we can directly get the opposition. Because now if the king tries to stay in front of the pawn, we've got the exact same scenario that we had before. So the correct move here is to move that pawn up forward. King has to yield the opposition. We take the other path. King stays in front, gain the opposition again. Because a mistake here would be to try to push your pawn a little bit too quickly. It may still work. Let's see. Now the king would stay here, get that opposition again. So now if the king did go here, now you see how it's a draw. Because black is fighting for a draw, there's really nothing else that you can do. He's always going to try to jump into this opposition, and that's why white would lose in this scenario. So you don't want to be too hasty moving your pawn. And then if you decide to yield and push your pawn, stay in front of the pawn. He really has no options here. Stay in front of the pawn. Doesn't really matter where he goes. Check. And then here's the draw for black. So that's why in that scenario, we didn't follow the main principle that we did before of trying to get your opponent or get into opposition so your opponent has to move. If you are too hasty with pushing your pawn, you may find yourself having to move out of opposition. So let's look at distant opposition. It's going to be essentially the same idea. You're separated, but by an odd number of squares. Whereas before we had 1 square between us, now we've got 5 here. So this is said to be a distant opposition. So we're going to start moving forward. We now have 3 squares, so it's opposition still. Same idea. So now we're in opposition. So black really only can move the king here, but we've simplified to the same exact idea. And now, again, white's move here. We do have that 1 square in between the pawns. Push. And then the same idea as we've seen. Don't forget, I almost moved the pawn. And then just stay in front, maintain that opposition. It can be very tricky. You just want to be very careful. So we've got that dream spot. Doesn't matter where we go. And we queen. So let's look at one more example of distant opposition, then we'll look at diagonal opposition. So here we've got 6 squares between the king, and if it's white to move, white would do what? Move into the distant opposition, because we're going to force black to move. So now we've got 5 squares between us. King comes forward, and if he tries to go diagonally, you're still going to try to match that opposition. So now, this scenario, white is able to break through to the other side of the pawns because of the attack. Whichever way black had decided to go, he would be limited in his squares. So right now, black would move here to try to defend his pawn, and then we just move forward. He can't come here, here, or here, and then we're just slowly working our way in. And there we go, we've got the opposition again. Opposition again, king has to move, and he can't protect the pawn anymore, so he moves away, and we're able to gain the pawn. Now here, unfortunately, we have the opposition against us, and our pawn is too far forward. So to finish the game, we actually can't win this pawn. Our whole goal is to get over to this pawn, and we would get there quicker. So let's just play out the end of the game. White would move this way, maintain the opposition, because now if I go back and forth, it's just going to be a draw. But here, we would just abandon our pawn, try to start moving the other way. If the king goes this way to try to protect this pawn, we're quicker to get this pawn, which will play out. But if the king decides to stay the opposition the entire way over here, well, now the king's just a little bit too far away from this pawn. And either way, whichever way, if he decides to chase the pawn, we'll just take this pawn and capture. So looking back at the other example, if he had gone, let's see, we went here. If we go this way and he starts going towards this pawn, same idea. It's more of just a distraction, but we've managed to get rid of the pawn that was blocking it originally to be able to create that distraction and then move our king to the other side. So from here, essentially we want to also use that opposition idea, but the king is just too late. Now the kings are in opposition, and this pawn can start to move up and become a queen and eventually checkmate. So that's opposition as well as distant opposition. What about diagonal opposition? So in this scenario here, white would love to be able to get that pawn, but he has to kind of work his way around. So from here, if it's we're both in opposition, so let's just say it's black's move, the way that you would have to move would probably be here to try to really, there's really no good moves here because you're in opposition. You're making a move that you don't want to move. So if he goes here, we're going to move into diagonal opposition, because let's just say we go here. Now black is has the opposition here, and white has to move. So if I have to move, it just becomes a draw. There's really nothing I can do. And even if I try to push this pawn, that will be a draw, as we'll see in a second. So from the original move, if he goes here, we want to move into diagonal opposition, which is going to be exactly the same thing, except we've got 1 square between us diagonally. So from here, the king, if he decides to go back this way, will move in. He can't go this way because we'll get the pawn. So he would go here, and then we will force him away. King is really running out of moves here. And then here's where we want to be careful, because if we decide to move in here, it's actually going to be a stalemate. So what we want to do in this scenario would be to push our pawn, the only move here is for him to take. And we don't want to take this pawn because it's just going to end up being a draw. If we take... Actually, no, that does work out. Correct. But even cooler would be, in this scenario, just to move here. The king has to push, check, and it's checkmate much quicker. This essentially would be a queen and checkmate. So those are a couple ideas for opposition, distant opposition, and diagonal opposition. They're really, really important principles to have. Let me know if you guys found this video interesting. There's a lot more videos that I want to do for endgame principles because I think in chess it's important to work your way backwards. Kind of understand the situation you want to get to, and then work your way towards that because it's easier to visualize that way. So thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video.